Don't touch my table. You people ruin places like this." The sentence didn't just land. It echoed, sharp enough to slice through the soft jazz and the low hum of million-dollar conversations. And for a split second, the entire restaurant seemed to freeze, forks suspended midair, glasses hovering inches from lips, eyes turning all at once toward the center of the room, where Ethan Caldwell sat like a man who had never been questioned a day in his life, his tailored suit crisp, his watch gleaming under the amber lights, his expression carved from pure entitlement. And in front of him stood Naomi Brooks, still as marble, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, a folded cloth in her hand, a single drop of red wine staining the white fabric near her wrist, and she didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't rush to clean it like everyone expected. She just stood there, breathing slow, eyes steady, as if the insult had passed through her without permission to stay, and that silence, that quiet refusal to react, unsettled something in the room more than any argument ever could, because people like Ethan were used to noise, to reactions, to power being acknowledged out loud. But Naomi gave him nothing, and nothing is the one thing power cannot control, and around them the restaurant glowed with wealth, polished marble floors reflecting golden light, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a skyline built on ambition, every table filled with people who measured time in deals and respect in dollars. And yet in that moment, none of it mattered. Because something invisible had shifted, something no one could name, but everyone could feel, and Ethan leaned back slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as if amused by her stillness, as if her silence confirmed every assumption he had already made about her. And he tapped the table once, slow, deliberate, the kind of gesture that didn't ask for attention but demanded it. And somewhere behind Naomi, a junior server hesitated, unsure whether to step in or stay out, because even the staff could feel it now, the tension stretching thin like glass about to crack. But Naomi didn't move, didn't break eye contact, didn't lower her gaze the way she had been taught would make nights like this easier, because Naomi Brooks had spent years in rooms like this, rooms where people decided your worth before you ever spoke, rooms where your uniform spoke louder than your voice. And she had learned something most of them never would. That power isn't always loud, and dignity doesn't need permission. And as the seconds passed, stretching longer than they should, Ethan's confidence flickered just enough to notice, just enough to make him shift in his chair, because silence, real silence, has a way of turning the spotlight back onto the one who started it. And for the first time that night, the room wasn't watching Naomi. They were watching him, waiting, wondering, sensing that whatever was about to happen next wasn't going to follow the script he thought he was writing. The air did not move, but everything had changed, and Ethan Caldwell felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift in the room where attention no longer followed his voice, but circled somewhere just beyond his reach. And he hated that feeling, the unfamiliar weight of not being in control. So he leaned forward again, slower this time, studying Naomi as if trying to place her back into a category that made sense to him. Because in his world, people like her were simple, predictable, background noise in expensive rooms. But Naomi Brooks did not behave like background noise. She stood with a stillness that did not ask for approval, and that alone made her dangerous in a way he could not explain. And around them, conversations tried to restart but failed, voices lowering into whispers that carried more curiosity than comfort, because people at tables like these knew power when they saw it, even when it was quiet, and they were beginning to question whether they had misread the room entirely. And Ethan tapped his fingers once more, sharper now, as if reclaiming rhythm would restore authority, but the sound echoed hollow, unanswered, and that was when a young assistant approached from the side, hesitant, careful with every step, like someone walking into a conversation they knew they should not interrupt, his voice barely above a whisper as he leaned toward Ethan. "Sir, perhaps we should review the contract details before proceeding." But Ethan waved him off without looking, dismissing him the same way he dismissed anything that threatened his control. Yet even that gesture lacked its usual certainty, because his eyes had not left Naomi, and Naomi had not moved, but something in her gaze had shifted, not anger, not defiance, something quieter, something closer to decision, as if she had already seen the outcome of this moment and was simply waiting for it to arrive. And behind her, the manager stood near the edge of the room, posture rigid, watching closely, too closely for a situation that should have been routine, and that detail did not escape the more observant guests. The ones who understood that hierarchy reveals itself in small things, in who watches whom, in who waits before speaking. And suddenly the room was no longer just a restaurant. It felt like a stage where roles had been assigned incorrectly, and everyone was beginning to notice, and Ethan felt it slipping, that invisible thread of dominance he had always held without effort. So he straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and spoke again, louder this time, forcing confidence back into his tone. I asked for a real server. But the words landed differently now, not sharp, not commanding, just loud, too loud, like someone trying to convince a room that still belonged to him. And Naomi finally moved, just one step forward, controlled, deliberate, enough to close the distance without raising her voice. And in that small movement, something settled, not in the room, but in the story itself, because the moment was no longer building. It had arrived, and everyone could feel it, even Ethan, though he did not yet understand why. Naomi's step was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said that night. And as she stopped just short of the table, the distance between her and Ethan felt different now, no longer defined by status or assumption, but by something far more unsettling, truth waiting to be revealed, and Ethan noticed it. The way her presence no longer fit the role he had assigned her. The way the room seemed to lean toward her without realizing it. And for the first time since he walked in, he hesitated, not visibly, not enough for most to catch, but enough to break the illusion he had built around himself. And Naomi spoke, her voice calm, steady, not loud, but it did not need to be, because silence had already done the work of clearing space for her words. You asked for a real server, she said, her tone even, almost reflective, as if repeating something that no longer belonged to him. And a few heads turned closer, listening now with intention, not curiosity, because something in her voice carried authority that could not be explained by a uniform. And Ethan let out a small breath, half laugh, half dismissal, trying to reclaim ground that was already slipping. That is right, he replied, leaning back again, forcing ease into his posture. Someone who understands the level of service this place is supposed to provide. And for a moment, it seemed like the script might return to normal, like the imbalance could be restored if he simply continued speaking. But Naomi did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply held the moment, letting his words settle in the air where everyone could hear them clearly, where everyone could measure them against what they were beginning to feel. And then, from across the room, the manager finally moved, not quickly, not nervously, but with a careful certainty that drew attention with every step. And when he reached Naomi's side, he did not speak immediately. He did not interrupt her. He waited, just slightly behind her shoulder, the way someone stands beside authority, not above it. And that was the detail that changed everything. Because the people who understood rooms like this saw it instantly. The alignment, the unspoken hierarchy, the quiet confirmation that something was not what it seemed. And a ripple passed through the guests, subtle but undeniable. A shift from watching a confrontation to witnessing a revelation. And Ethan saw it too, though he did not yet have the language for it. His eyes flicking briefly toward the manager, then back to Naomi, searching for clarity where there had only been certainty before. And Naomi finally turned her head slightly, acknowledging the manager with the smallest nod, not a request, not a question, just permission. And the manager inhaled once, steadying himself before speaking, his voice controlled but carrying across the room with unmistakable clarity. Sir, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. And the words landed differently than any apology or explanation that might have followed, because they did not defend, they did not soften, they prepared. And Ethan's expression tightened, just enough to reveal the first crack in his confidence, as the room leaned in, waiting, sensing that the next sentence would not just correct a moment, but redefine it entirely. The manager's words did not rush. They settled, deliberate and precise. Sir, you are not speaking to a server. And the pause that followed stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for the meaning to begin forming before it was fully spoken, long enough for the room to feel the shift before understanding it. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, a reflex more than a reaction, because something in the tone did not match the situation he believed he controlled, and he glanced around, searching for confirmation that this was still his stage. But the eyes that met his were no longer aligned with him. They were waiting, watching Naomi, and the manager continued, his voice steady, respectful but firm. "You are speaking to Ms. Naomi Brooks." And he stopped there, just for a second, as if giving the name space to carry its own weight. But it was not enough. Not yet. And Naomi stepped forward that final inch, closing the distance completely, her presence calm, unshaken, her voice softer than the manager's, but somehow louder in impact. "I believe what he is trying to say," she said, her gaze steady on Ethan, "is that there has been a misunderstanding about roles tonight." And a faint ripple moved through the room. Not laughter, not shock, something closer to realization beginning to take shape, and Ethan exhaled through his nose, a short breath, controlled, attempting to reassert logic over whatever this moment was becoming. "Then clarify it," he said, his tone sharper. Now, less composed, because confidence without control begins to sound like impatience. And Naomi did not hesitate, did not look away. She simply reached up, slow and deliberate, and untied the apron at her waist, the fabric slipping free with a quiet motion that seemed louder than any sound in the room. And she folded it once, neatly, placing it on the edge of the table as if returning something that had only ever been temporary. And that was when the room truly went silent, not the polite quiet of expensive spaces, but the kind of silence that arrives when understanding hits all at once. And Naomi lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, not in pride, but in clarity. "I am the owner," she said, her voice even, unshaken, and the words did not echo. They landed, heavy and undeniable, and across the room, a glass was set down too quickly. A chair shifted, someone inhaled sharply, but no one spoke, because nothing could follow that statement without acknowledging it. And Ethan did not move, not at first, his expression caught between disbelief and calculation, as if trying to rewrite the last 60 seconds into something that made sense. But the details would not rearrange, the manager's posture, the room's reaction, Naomi's stillness. It all pointed to the same conclusion, one he had not prepared for. And Naomi held his gaze, not to challenge him, not to prove anything, but simply because she no longer needed to be seen through his perspective. And that was the moment everything reversed, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with truth, simple and quiet, standing where assumption used to be. For a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what had been said, but because they understood it completely. And understanding like that is weight. It presses down on a room. It forces people to reevaluate what they thought they knew, and Ethan felt it settle over him, heavy and undeniable, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once but in pieces, each detail clicking into place with uncomfortable clarity, the manager standing behind her not as a superior but as support, the way the staff had watched her instead of intervening, the calm in her voice that never once asked for permission, and suddenly every assumption he had made began to unravel. And he straightened in his chair, slower now, more deliberate, as if posture alone could restore something that had already slipped away. "That is not possible," he said, his voice lower, tighter, no longer meant for the room, but for himself. And Naomi did not react to the denial. She did not correct him. Immediately, she allowed the moment to breathe, because truth does not need to rush. And across the room, conversations had fully stopped, phones lowered slightly. Attention sharpened, because people in places like this understood when something rare was happening, when power was being redefined in real time. And Naomi reached toward the table, not toward him, but toward the folded apron she had just set down, adjusting it slightly, aligning the edge with the polished surface as if even the smallest detail deserved intention, and that small gesture carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. And then she spoke again, calm, precise. "You are here for a partnership discussion," she said, her tone steady, factual, as if outlining terms rather than defending identity. "A $20 million expansion into 3 new locations across the West Coast." And Ethan blinked once, the number catching him off guard not because it was unfamiliar, but because she spoke it with ownership, not awareness. And Naomi continued, You reviewed the proposal last week, page 14 outlined. The equity structure, and a flicker crossed his face, recognition breaking through disbelief. Because those details were not public, they were not something a server would know. They were specific, exact, and suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, as if every wall had moved an inch closer, and Ethan's fingers, once tapping with control, now rested still against the table, his silence no longer chosen but forced, and Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. And she added, just enough to close the distance between truth and understanding. You were not just speaking to the owner, she said softly. You were speaking to the person deciding whether you belong here at all. And the words did not rise, they settled, firm and final, and somewhere behind them, a glass was set down with a quiet clink that sounded louder than it should have, because the room had shifted completely now no longer a place where Ethan controlled the outcome, but a place where he was being measured, and for the first time that night, he had nothing to say. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into something heavier than embarrassment, something closer to exposure, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way his chest tightened just slightly, in the way his usual instincts failed to offer him an immediate response, because for the first time in a very long time, there was no obvious move, no strategy that could quickly restore his position, and that realization alone was enough to unsettle him more than any confrontation ever could, and he shifted in his chair, slower now, more measured, his mind racing through details, trying to reconstruct the moment, to find the point where control had slipped, but every path led back to the same truth standing in front of him, calm and unshaken, and Naomi did not press him, she did not repeat herself, she simply allowed the weight of what had been said to settle fully, because people reveal themselves most clearly in what they do next when there is nothing left to hide behind, and around them. The room had changed completely, no longer a place of casual luxury, but a quiet audience, every guest aware they were witnessing something rare, not a scene, but a shift, the kind that does not happen often and is never forgotten when it does, and a man at a nearby table lowered his glass slowly, careful not to make a sound, as if even the smallest interruption would disrupt something important, and Ethan finally inhaled, a deeper breath this time, steadying himself, recalibrating, because if there was one thing he had built his reputation on, it was adaptation, the ability to recover, to pivot, to regain ground even when it seemed lost, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, not softer, not weaker, but controlled in a way that suggested calculation rather than confidence. If that is the case, he said, choosing each word carefully, then I believe there has been a misunderstanding on both sides, and the phrasing was deliberate, an attempt to level the ground, to reframe the moment into something mutual rather than one-sided. And Naomi heard it for exactly what it was, not an apology, not yet, but a negotiation tactic, a step toward reclaiming balance, and she let it sit there for a moment, giving it space to exist, before deciding whether it deserved a response. And then she tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge his effort without validating it, and said, a misunderstanding implies both sides were unclear, her tone still even, still composed. I was very clear about who I was, and the words landed with precision, not sharp, but exact, removing any ambiguity he had tried to introduce. And a quiet murmur passed through the room, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal agreement. Recognition, because clarity like that does not require volume to be heard, and Ethan's jaw tightened again. But this time he did not interrupt, he did not push back immediately, because somewhere beneath the layers of pride and habit, he understood something had already been decided, not in contracts or numbers, but in character, and Naomi stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to shift the dynamic once more, no longer standing as someone being evaluated, but as someone who had already finished evaluating, and she glanced briefly toward the manager, then back to Ethan, her expression unchanged, her voice steady as she spoke again. The only question left, she said, is whether you understand it now. And in that moment, the room held its breath, because everyone knew, this was no longer about business, it was about something far more difficult to recover, respect. The question did not echo, but it lingered, settling into the space between them like something that could not be ignored, and Ethan Caldwell felt it more than he heard it, because there was no easy way around it, no polished phrase that could smooth it over, and for the first time that night, he did not reach for control, he reached for clarity, and that alone changed the way the room looked at him, because power that pauses is no longer assumed. It is examined, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the shift, not surrender, not weakness, but recognition, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something unfamiliar. I understand that I misjudged the situation, he said, each word measured, deliberate, as if choosing them carefully might restore some balance, and the room listened, not for the apology itself, but for what it revealed about the man who had just minutes ago believed he owned the moment, and Naomi watched him without interruption, without approval, simply observing, because understanding is not proven by words, it is revealed by what follows them, and Ethan continued, a slight pause between his sentences, and I recognized that my behavior did not reflect the level of respect this establishment deserves. And there it was, the closest thing to an apology he had likely given in years, wrapped in professionalism, structured, controlled, but still undeniably different from where he had started, and a subtle shift moved through the room. Not relief, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, because even change, when it is real, begins quietly. And Naomi tilted her head just slightly, considering, not the words alone, but the intention behind them, and she stepped back another inch, not retreating, but redefining the space between them once more, and her voice, when she spoke, remained steady, unchanged by his shift. Respect is not something a place demands, she said, her tone calm, reflective. It is something people choose to bring with them. And the sentence settled over the room with the same quiet weight as everything else she had said, because it was not directed only at him. It was universal, a truth that extended beyond the table, beyond the moment, and Ethan nodded once, small, controlled, absorbing it, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to negotiate, and for a brief second, the tension eased, not disappeared, but softened, like a storm that had passed its peak but had not yet cleared. And then Naomi glanced toward the skyline beyond the glass, the city lights reflecting softly in her eyes, before returning her attention to him. And when she spoke again, her words carried a different kind of finality. The partnership you came here for, she said, was never just about numbers. And Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, because now he understood what was coming next. And the room leaned in once more, not out of curiosity, but because they all knew this was the decision. The moment where everything that had happened would finally take shape, and Naomi held his gaze, calm, unwavering, and added, it was about alignment. And in that single word, the outcome was already written, even before she said anything else. The word hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said that night. Alignment, simple, precise, impossible to argue with. And Ethan Caldwell understood immediately that this was no longer a negotiation he could steer. This was a conclusion he had already walked into without realizing it, and for a brief moment, he looked at Naomi not as someone he could influence, but as someone who had already made her decision, and that realization stripped away the last layer of control he had been holding on to, and the room felt it, the shift from possibility to outcome, from tension to inevitability, and Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She allowed it to settle, because decisions that matter are not announced with urgency. They are revealed with certainty, and she stepped slightly to the side, not away from him, but into a position that no longer centered the confrontation. Her posture relaxed but intentional, as if the moment had already moved past him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word she had said so far. Alignment means more than shared goals, she said, her eyes steady. It means shared values, how people are treated when no one thinks it matters. And a quiet ripple moved through the room, not because the words were dramatic, but because they were undeniable, and Ethan felt them land, not as an attack, but as a mirror, reflecting something he could no longer dismiss. And he inhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second before returning to hers, because even now, he was searching for a way to respond, to adjust, to recover, But some moments do not offer recovery, only recognition, and Naomi continued, not raising her voice, not emphasizing her authority, simply stating what had already become clear. Tonight showed me everything I needed to see, and there was no anger in it, no satisfaction, just finality, and somewhere in the background, a server resumed movement. Quiet, careful, as if the room itself was beginning to breathe again. But no one spoke, no one interrupted, because they all understood. This was the part that mattered most, and Ethan straightened slightly, not in defiance, but in acceptance, his expression no longer guarded by arrogance, but shaped by something closer to realization, and he nodded once, small, controlled, acknowledging what could not be undone. And Naomi met that nod with the same composed stillness she had carried from the beginning, and then, without changing her tone, she delivered the conclusion. We will not be moving forward with the partnership. And the words did not echo. They settled, final and complete, and the room absorbed them in silence, because everyone there understood exactly what had just been lost, not just a deal, not just $20 million, but something far more difficult to quantify. And Ethan did not argue, did not protest, because in that moment, he knew there was nothing left to negotiate, and Naomi gave a slight nod toward the manager, a quiet signal that the moment was over, and as she turned away, the room remained still, not because they were waiting for more, but because they had just witnessed something they would not forget, a reminder that power is not always where it appears to be, and that respect, once revealed, cannot be reclaimed by words alone. The room did not erupt. It did not react the way movies teach people to expect. There was no applause, no loud whispers, just a quiet return to movement, the kind that follows something significant, something that leaves a mark without needing to announce it. And Naomi Brooks walked away from the table with the same steady pace she had carried all night, not faster, not slower, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer questioned. And as she moved past the tables, people who had not looked at her before now did, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that comes too late to change anything but just in time to be remembered. And behind her, Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, not because he did not know what to do next, but because he understood that whatever he did would no longer carry the same weight it had when he first arrived. And that realization stayed with him as he finally stood, adjusting his jacket out of habit, a gesture that once restored control, but now felt like an echo of something that had already passed. And he glanced around the room, noticing details he had ignored before, the staff moving with quiet precision, the guests who no longer avoided eye contact, the subtle shift in atmosphere that told him this place had never been what he assumed it was. And he stepped away from the table without another word, not out of pride, but out of understanding, because there are moments when silence is the only response left that carries any meaning. And across the room, Naomi paused briefly near the entrance, exchanging a few quiet words with the manager, her tone calm, composed, already moving forward, because for her, this moment was not an ending. It was simply confirmation, and as the doors opened and closed behind Ethan, the city lights outside reflecting against the glass, the restaurant returned to its rhythm, but not entirely the same, because something had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed it. And Naomi turned back toward the dining floor, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and in that quiet continuation, the real message settled, not spoken, not announced, but understood, that power without awareness is fragile, that respect is not earned through status, but revealed through behavior, and that sometimes the people you overlook are not just part of the room, they are the reason it exists. And she did not raise her voice, she did not demand recognition, she simply let the truth stand where it belonged, and that was enough.